I want to tell you about a garden and an old soldier and 7 long conversations I wrote down between them. The garden was real. It belonged to a family called the Rucellai, just outside the walls of Florence. The kind of place where comfortable young men gathered in the evenings to talk about poetry, about old Roman writers, about the sort of beautiful, weightless ideas that only people who have never truly been afraid have the luxury of discussing. Into this garden, I brought a visitor, a real soldier named Fabrizio Colonna, a professional commander who had spent decades on actual battlefields, watching real men die for real reasons, and for no reason at all. I let the young men ask him, almost as a kind of game, to sit and explain to them what war actually was. And the first thing I had him say to them, because it is the foundation everything else stands on, sounds, on its surface, like a small complaint. He says, there is nothing in our time more separated from each other, more foreign to one another, than the life of a citizen and the life of a soldier. I meant that completely. In the Italy I was writing about, war had become someone else's job, a specialist's job. Cities did not fight their own battles anymore. They hired men to do it, mercenaries, professionals who fought for coin and owed the city nothing beyond the length of their contract. And this arrangement, I came to believe, is how a civilization quietly kills itself, without ever quite noticing that it is doing so. I had Fabrizio point the young men back toward Rome, back towards Sparta before it. In the old world, the soldier and the citizen were never 2 separate men. The same man who argued in the public square in the morning picked up a sword in the afternoon if his city needed him to. There was no separation. War was not a service purchased from strangers. War was something a citizen simply was, the moment his home required it of him. One of the young men, Cosimo, pushes back. Surely, he says, professionals must be better at this than ordinary men with no training. Surely a paid soldier, who does nothing else with his life, must outmatch a farmer who only fights when called. And I gave Fabrizio my sharpest answer to that. A mercenary army, he says, is both useless and dangerous. Useless, because a hired soldier has no true reason to risk his life for you. His loyalty extends only as far as the coin in his hand, the moment the money stops, or the moment your enemy offers more. He vanishes, or worse, he turns. And dangerous, because if these hired men are skilled enough to win your wars for you, they are skilled enough to simply take your city for themselves the moment the war is won. Why would they hand you the victory and walk quietly home when they could keep the prize they bled to take? City after city across Italy hired soldiers of fortune to defend walls those same soldiers felt nothing for. And I made Fabrizio say what I believed. This is why these cities kept losing, not because their people were weak or foolish, because they had handed away the one thing in this world that cannot actually be bought, the willingness to die for something. You cannot purchase that, I wrote. You can only grow it. And it only grows in people who genuinely believe the thing they are defending belongs to them. This is why, through Fabrizio's voice, I kept returning again and again to the same insistence that any real army must be built from the people of the state itself. Not foreigners, not professionals for hire, farmers, craftsmen, sons of the city. Trained, yes. Disciplined, yes. But underneath the armor, still ordinary citizens with a genuine stake in what happens next. There is something I believed about loyalty buried quietly inside this argument. Loyalty is not a feeling that can be rented. It only exists truly when a person's fate and the fate of the thing they are protecting have become the same fate. The mercenary can walk away from a burning city, and his life simply continues elsewhere. But the citizen has nowhere else his life continues. If the walls fall, his home falls with them. There is no walking away. And that, I came to believe, is the only loyalty strong enough to actually be trusted with a city's survival. So I had the conversation turn toward a harder question. If ordinary citizens are to be the soldiers, how does a farmer, a craftsman, a merchant's son become someone who can stand still on a battlefield instead of running or freezing or falling apart the moment real danger arrives? I gave Fabrizio an answer here that I believed without reservation. Almost no man is naturally brave, I had him say. Real courage, in sufficient measure, is not something most men simply carry inside them from birth. What looks like courage on a battlefield is, in nearly every case, something manufactured, built, repeated into a man until it stops feeling like a choice and starts to feel like instinct. I pointed the young men to the old Romans and the Spartans before them and made the argument that mattered most to me in the entire book. Their secret was never some special natural ferocity. Their secret was that their training was harder than the war itself. I want you to sit with that sentence the way I sat with it for years. Their training was harder than the war itself. This meant that by the time a Roman soldier stood on a real battlefield, facing real arrows and real men screaming and trying to kill him, none of it was actually the worst thing he had ever lived through. He had already survived worse. On purpose, deliberately, built by men who understood something true about how a human being actually becomes capable of enduring extreme things. A man does not become brave by wanting it badly enough. He becomes brave because, when the real difficulty finally arrives, he has already stood somewhere harder than it, on purpose, long before. And so the thing meant to break him arrives feeling, strangely, almost familiar. This led me toward a comparison I knew would unsettle those comfortable young men, because it cut against everything their fashionable education had taught them to admire. Discipline matters more than fury, I had Fabrizio tell them. Order matters more than raw passion. A calm, organized force will defeat a far larger force of furious, undisciplined men nearly every time. This was, for my readers, a genuinely uncomfortable thing to hear, because the popular imagination of war has always loved the image of the wild warrior, the man who charges forward on pure rage and pure heart, overwhelming everything in his path through sheer ferocity of spirit. It is a beautiful image. It fills old poems. It hangs on the walls of palaces. And I looked directly at that beautiful image through Fabrizio's mouth and said, "This is a fantasy, and believing it will get you killed. Fury burns hot, and it burns out quickly. An army running on pure feeling, if it does not win in the first decisive moments, begins to panic the instant things stop unfolding exactly as its emotions promised. But disciplined men, men trained to hold position, to listen for a command, to move as a single body rather than a crowd of separate passions. These men can absorb a setback without falling apart. They can retreat in order instead of in panic. They can be redirected in the middle of chaos because they are still listening, still functioning as one thing, rather than each man simply following the heat of his own blood. Order, I argued, is what allows an army to survive its own first mistake. And every army makes one. The only real question is whether anything is left standing after it. There is a detail in how I had Fabrizio describe battle formation that I think carries far beyond anything military. I insisted that an army should never spread itself thin into one long, impressive-looking line. Instead, build it in layers. A front line, a second line behind it, a reserve, held back, untouched, waiting. My reasoning was this: the front line will always weaken, always. No matter how strong it is at the start, it will tire, it will lose men, it will eventually begin to buckle. If nothing waits behind it, if everything has already been spent on that single line, then the moment it gives way, everything is lost at once. But if fresh men are waiting, ready to step forward exactly when the front line falters, ready to replace exhaustion with strength at the precise moment exhaustion would otherwise become collapse, then a battle that looks lost in its middle hour can still be won by its end. I did not write this only for soldiers. Almost nothing important in a life is won in a single uninterrupted push. The first resolve, the first burst of energy and nerve, it is not infinite. It will weaken. That is simply what happens to any finite thing under enough sustained pressure. What decides the outcome of hard things is not whether the first effort holds forever. It will not. What decides it is whether something was built behind that first effort, whether a second wave of resolve waits quietly, ready to step into the gap exactly when the first one starts to fail. I was describing infantry, but I was also, without quite saying so directly, describing the whole architecture of endurance. Then I let the conversation turn towards something darker. I had one of the young men ask, almost innocently, shouldn't a wise commander try to win with as little bloodshed as possible? Shouldn't sparing lives always be the goal? I gave Fabrizio an answer with more weight in it than people usually credit me for. Yes, he says, a wise commander always prefers to win through hunger rather than through steel, through patience, through cutting off supply, through forcing the enemy into a place where continuing simply becomes impossible, rather than a direct, bloody collision where both sides simply tear at each other. In a victory won through hunger, fortune plays a smaller part and skill a far larger one. A siege that quietly starves an enemy into surrender is a triumph of planning. A battle decided by chaos and slaughter is, even in victory, partly just a triumph of luck. So underneath everything, there was a genuine preference for the bloodless path, not cruelty for its own sake. But here is the harder truth I also believed. When the bloodless path simply is not available, when the enemy will not starve, will not retreat, cannot be maneuvered into surrender, then a commander who hesitates, who softens, who tries to fight a real war with half measures because he cannot fully face what war actually demands, is not being kind. He is being incompetent. And that incompetence will cost more of his own men's lives than full, swift commitment ever would have. This, I think, sits at the center of everything in this book. I never argued that cruelty is good. I argued that half-cruelty applied with hesitation, with one foot still standing in a world of wishful thinking, is almost always worse than full commitment to whatever a situation truly requires. If you must fight, fight completely. If you can show mercy, show it completely and quickly enough that it actually accomplishes something. What destroys men, what loses wars, what brings down cities, is the in-between. The leader who wants to be both a saint and a soldier, and in the end succeeds at being neither. There is a small passage about deserters that I have always thought was one of the quietest, most honest things in the whole book, and it has almost nothing to do with tactics. When soldiers desert the enemy and come to your side, I had Fabrizio say, "This is a significant gain for you, provided they prove loyal," because the enemy feels the loss of a deserter far more deeply than the loss of a man simply killed. A man killed in battle is the loss of one body. A man who deserts is something else. He is living proof, visible to everyone he leaves behind, that the cause itself might be failing. He plants a question in the mind of every man who stays. He left. Should I? Death does not spread doubt the way a living deserter does. The dead tell you nothing. A man who walked away and now stands alive on the other side tells you something just by existing, that staying might have been the worst bet all along. And I added something I still find quietly sad. The deserter himself gains very little real comfort from his choice. His new allies will always look at him a little sideways. He proved, after all, that he is capable of leaving once things turn against him, and his old companions despise him completely, seeing him as closer to a traitor than a survivor. He gains the practical advantage of staying alive and loses nearly everything else. He belongs nowhere, fully, ever again. I should be honest about something I got wrong in this book, because I think it tells you something true about the limits of even careful thinking. In the years I was writing, gunpowder weapons, early artillery, were beginning to change how wars were fought, and you might expect that I would have been obsessed with this new force. Instead, I doubted it. I argued that disciplined infantry could close the distance and neutralize cannon before it did real damage. I worried that too much faith in machines would make commanders lazy, would let them believe that iron could replace the slower, harder work of building disciplined men. History did not agree with me. Artillery only grew more decisive in the years after this book, not less. On this point, I was simply wrong. But the reason I was wrong matters more than the mistake itself. The whole argument of this book rests on a deep faith in human character as the true deciding force in war. Not luck, not machines, not the old, unpredictable notion of fortune that simply happens to a man from outside himself. Character, discipline, what I called virtue, closer to capability and force of will than to simple goodness. I wanted to believe that a disciplined man, properly trained and properly led, could outlast almost any force thrown against him, even a machine. And in the case of artillery, that belief led the argument somewhere false. Sometimes the cannon simply wins, no matter how brave or well-drilled the men standing in front of it happen to be. Near the end of the dialogue, I had Cosimo ask something that barely belongs in a treatise about war at all. He asks whether all of this, the discipline, the hardship, the training Fabrizio wants placed on ordinary citizens, is actually good for them, or whether it simply makes men harder, colder, more like instruments, and less like human beings. I gave my answer through Fabrizio, and it is the truest thing in the whole book. A state that cannot defend itself, he says, is not actually free. It only appears free, for as long as no one stronger decides to take what it has. The moment a hungrier, more disciplined neighbor decides a city is worth taking, every philosophy, every poem, every soft and civilized pleasure its people have spent their lives enjoying will not matter at all. It will simply be taken. And the people who built that beautiful, undefended life will not be remembered as wise or gentle. They will be remembered, if remembered at all, as people too comfortable to notice they had already been conquered, long before the first sword was drawn. This is the hardest argument in the entire book. Peace is not the natural resting state of the world. Peace is an achievement maintained continuously by people willing to do the unglamorous, often difficult work of preparing for a danger that everyone else is comfortable pretending will never arrive. The young men in my garden wanted to talk about poetry, about old Roman rhetoric, about the fine pleasures of a civilized mind. I let the old soldier sit with them patiently, answering everything they asked. But underneath all of his patience, I gave him one warning he kept returning to, in one form or another, all the way to the very end. Enjoy the garden. Just never forget, even for a moment, what it actually costs to keep it yours. That is everything I wanted to tell you about this book tonight. If you're still awake, I hope something in this followed you gently towards sleep. And if you have already drifted off somewhere along the way, that is all right too. That is, I think, what these quiet conversations are for. You have been listening to Night Philosophy. We will return with another book and another conversation